This is a very important year, 2019, that we just entered. It's the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And it's extraordinary now to look back and think about the euphoria that was in the air the decade after 1989. That there was a sense somehow that lots of things were going to be different, that more and more countries would be able to determine their own destinies, that freeing up trade would make people more prosperous, and therefore there'd be less conflict in the world. And there was a sense that we would all be in contact more with each other. Phrases like a world without borders were popular then. And you heard a lot of John Lennon, when the world was be as one at the end of his song, Imagine. Well, we've come a long way in 30 years, and not many of those hopes have stayed with us, though globalization has brought many benefits. It's brought a lot of problems as well, which we know about. But perhaps the most surprising development, given the euphoria of the 1990s, was the rise of identity politics and conflict over identity. It's taken many forms, rises of different forms of religious fundamentalism, nationalist racist parties that are growing in many Western democracies, and also domestic politics in many countries are now in turmoil over questions of identity, not questions of class and other traditional ones. So it's a good time to ask ourselves, what is it about the globalization that we've experienced in the past 30 years that in fact might be encouraging the identity conflicts that we're seeing today? Well, there are two answers to this question, one which is conventional, and I'll be defending a rather unconventional one today. The conventional answer is that, well, globalization has put us all more in contact with difference. The word difference has become important in academic circles. That more trade, more communications, immigration, the internet, have put peoples from very different cultures in contact with each other. And it's out of that new contact that people are having reactions when there's a competition for resources or misunderstandings, or especially when there are fears. And when there are economic fears in a country, it's very easy to pick on immigrants and to focus on identity questions in order to create a kind of scapegoat. So the idea is that globalism creates difference, or we confront difference. Difference leads to a reaction. And if that's the case, then the conventional response to that really is we have to do two things. One is we have to, in a sense, neutralize our identity attachments, not take them quite so seriously, to focus, for example, on the fact that, well, in one country they make curry one way, in another they make it in a second way, and now we can celebrate our cultural differences. It's very superficial. But the other is that we need to teach more toleration. We need to be able to get out of our heads more in order to understand people who come from other cultures. Now, that conventional explanation does explain many of the things that we've experienced over the past 30 years. But I think that what we're starting to experience in many countries, certainly in Europe, which I'll talk about in a moment, is something quite different. Let me propose to you that, in fact, the most important experience one has through globalization is not the experience of difference, it's the experience of sameness. That economic globalization has flattened the world, as Tom Friedman told us a couple decades ago, And we're aware of that when it comes to economics, trade, goods, communication. But globalization has also flattened the cultural landscape worldwide. The examples you all know, I can mention the prevalence of English as an elite language around the world right now, the presence of goods everywhere. I was thinking about that. This is my first time to Dubai, and I was thinking, well, it doesn't really make sense for me to go to the malls here, the fantastic malls, because probably I can't find anything different from what I'd find in New York, where I live. Travel used to be an experience of discovering new shops, bringing something home. Well, I haven't brought anything home from a trip in a very long time because there's not much difference. Cuisine is another interesting example. You know, a great fear back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was that we'd all be eating McDonald's. Instead, what people in our class are eating is a range of ethnic cuisines that has become the McDonald's of the elite class around the world. You can see it at the hotel right here. You have Chinese restaurant, you have Lebanese restaurant, and all the rest. And this has become our cuisine. But it's not something that gets passed on from generation to generation. Chefs today are learning their cuisine from cookbooks, not from their grandmothers. And that's an important development. Food is very important for the thickness of a culture. And then, of course, internet culture. Our children are much more alike than we are alike in this room. And we can expect that to become more and more the case with time. Now, these are rather obvious examples, but I want to bring home the point that one of the big challenges of our time is not multiculturalism. It is going to be, and is already, monoculturalism, and how we cope with that. And that leads to a different kind of identity, anxiety, and conflict. The more we feel we are the same, the weaker our sense of we becomes. A sense of we in this place, we in this time, we who share this religion, we who share these customs. Now, culture in that sense is all about transmission. That it's through culture that you transmit values, you transmit faith, you transmit cooking recipes, and all the rest. It's a machine for transmitting from a generation to the next. But the moment people feel they could be living anywhere, or they have one foot in their country of origin and somewhere else, there is not a mechanism anymore for transmitting commitment to the place that you were born. And this is going to be a real challenge in over the decades to come. It's when we feel committed to a place, when we share customs with people, that we learn to trust them. We learn to commit ourselves. We learn to think about future generations. We're even willing to sacrifice ourselves for later generations. But the less we feel bound to a place, and therefore that binding makes us different from others, the less committed I think we are becoming and will become to making sacrifices for the future. And the result of the dissolution of this we, I think, is that people are already feeling a loss of political agency. That the less one feels committed, the less people in one's society feel committed, the less power collectively people feel they have. We feel like we're elementary particles floating in space and not part of a narrative of one particular culture or country. And when people lose political agency, when they feel that they do not control their destinies, they get fearful and they get angry. And I think that a lot of the identity politics that we're seeing in the world today, especially in conflictual terms, comes not so much from distrust or hatred of the other, but an anxiety in the face of a monoculture that no longer roots us in a place. The new experience for people is feeling homeless when you're already at home. A good example of these dynamics, I think, is what's happened in Europe over the past 30 years. If you step back, you can see that Europeans in these past 3 decades have conducted 3 social experiments on themselves at the same time. The first is signing trade agreements that freeze trade and the flows of capital, and along with that, the flows of labor. The Europeans have tried to establish a European Union that is integrated in a bureaucratic sense, but not in a political sense, so it has no political identity. The European Union feels like it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And finally, national governments and the EU have been unable to control the flows of immigration, so that people in European countries feel that if they vote for a certain level of immigration, that that limit is going to be recognized. With these 3 experiments simultaneously, it seems to me understandable that there's been a kind of reaction in Europe. A sense of not knowing who we are, not knowing what the future will bring, not knowing who our neighbors are, and not being able to anticipate and therefore invest in the future. I'm not sure anyone knows what it means to be Dutch today, what it means to be Italian. These things used to have a thick meaning, and they don't any longer. And it's all 3 of these factors that have contributed to the sense of being nowhere, not having control of your destiny, and therefore being angry. And in a situation like that, people become very susceptible to demagogues. Demagogues who want to give them a kind of fake or ersatz identity in order to give them an artificial sense that they're controlling their futures, when in fact it's the demagogues themselves. It's very interesting that, and this is true in the United States as well, the more experience you have with immigrants, the less likely you're going to be worried about immigration. And in many areas of Europe right now, it's in areas that experience virtually no immigration that anxiety about it is so strong, and where nationalist and racist parties have become so powerful. So what we've experienced is a kind of disappearing we in the face of globalization. It's not so much that people have strong identities and they're clashing. Rather, people are having identity anxiety and therefore are grasping onto things that then might bring them into conflict. So the question, the task really, is how might it be possible to develop and strengthen a healthy we, not a reactionary we, not a racist we, but a we that contributes to thinking about the common good and about the future? Well, in order to do that, I think we have to face reality. And the reality, as I've tried to suggest, and it will increasingly be our reality, is that culture is no longer going to bind peoples and nations together the way it has since the beginning of time. That we are increasingly going to feel ourselves to be in a monoculture, so that cultural norms and traditions will no longer automatically connect us to and commit us to the place where we We're born. Language will not be serving that purpose. Customs will not be serving that purpose. And increasingly, religion will not be serving it either. None of them will be enough, in my view. But there is one kind of identity that doesn't depend on custom or religion or language. And that's political identity. The identity you have as a citizen of a country along with other citizens. When you live in a country, there is such a thing as the common good. There are things that affect everyone, from the environment to the state of the economy to the education of children. There is a common good. But you need a sense of sharing a destiny with people in order to protect it and promote it. And if culture is not serving that function, something else has to. And that's why I think it's crucial in the years to come that governments and peoples pay more and more attention to developing a sense of identity as citizens and not relying so heavily on culture. Aristotle, many centuries ago, talked about something he called political friendship. In his book on ethics, he said there are many kinds of friendship, but one kind is political friendship. It's just the general feeling you have when you're in a place that people trust each other and care about the place in which they live. And this notion of political friendship was picked up in the Middle Ages in the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish traditions. The Muslim philosopher Al-Farabi, for example, talks about political friendship and how a wise caliph will try to build a sense of a shared destiny and trust among people. He says it's even more important than justice. And the reason it's more important than justice is because friendship is an instinct. You don't have to think about it. You just recognize people as sharing a future and a destiny with you. Well, in order to do that, to build up this sort of political identity, I think two things are really necessary. One, I think, is that our focus has to shift from multiculturalism to civic education, to a focus on citizenship as the glue that binds us together in each of our countries, knowing that the other kinds of glue are dissolving right now and turning liquid. And so civic education is going to have to be even more important. But that civic education will be vain unless people also feel they have a voice. Governments, if they want to establish a strong civic education, will also need to respond to their citizens. And it's crucial that they think about that starting now, because the forces of this monoculturalism, the forces at work in it, can already be felt in many countries around the world. And what do you know, as I'm reading over lunch this excellent newspaper, The National, newspaper, on the front page it says, Sheikh Khalifa launches government body to promote sense of civic duty. That's exactly the point. Civic duty has to be inculcated at a very early age, and it has to be based on a political idea, not just a cultural one. And I say this not out of idealism. I'm trying to be as practical as possible. In the years that come, culture will not be enough. Economic growth will not be enough. There has to be some sort of tie that's established among people in our societies, and that has to start with civic education. Thank you very much.